Johnny Carson. For 30 years, he was the undisputed king of late-night television, entering America's living rooms every evening with that familiar, reassuring smile. His face was as recognizable as any president's, his voice as comforting as a friend's. But those who truly knew him, the producers, writers, and crew who spent decades by his side, understood that behind the warm grin was a very different man. Carson kept his emotions locked away like valuables in a safe, distant, controlled, utterly unreachable. 4 failed marriages, countless broken friendships, and a personality consistently described as cold and emotionally unavailable. That was the real Johnny Carson behind the cameras. But backstage, he harbored deep admiration for certain guests. Here are 6 people who got closest to him, yet whose relationships never showed on camera. Johnny's love wasn't like normal people's love, recalled a longtime Tonight Show producer who worked with him for over 15 years. When he loved someone, he wouldn't say it, but he'd protect them. Silently from the shadows, he'd elevate their careers, shield them from enemies, open doors they didn't know existed, but never ever tell them to their face. It was as if admitting his love would make him vulnerable, and Johnny couldn't stand being vulnerable in front of anyone. My Carson's secret favorites weren't just guests to him, they were people this emotionally guarded man felt closest to, admired, and even considered family. But Carson's love always came with a price: control, fear, distance, and sometimes unforgivable betrayal. Let's start with the man who sat beside him every night but never truly knew him. Ed McMahon owned America's most familiar voice. Every night, millions heard that booming call, "Here's Johnny." This phrase signaled the start of late night for 30 years. McMahon met Carson in 1958 on a Philadelphia game show, laying the foundation for television's longest partnership. But beneath it lay a bond never expressed in words. On air, McMahon was exactly what he appeared: loyal, reliable, the perfect sidekick, laughing at Johnny's every joke. When Carson faced difficult moments, Ed stepped in to diffuse tension. To viewers, they seemed like brothers who'd grown up together. But backstage, their relationship was more complicated. They sat side by side for 30 years, yet rarely spent time together outside the studio. Johnny truly loved Ed in his own way, recalled a former head producer. But Johnny's love wasn't like other people's. He was terrified of showing emotion, of being vulnerable. The most revealing moment came in the late 1980s, when McMahon faced serious financial trouble. His house was under foreclosure threat. One day, an anonymous check arrived at McMahon's lawyer's office with only a note. For old friends, McMahon knew it was from Carson, but they never discussed it, not once. That was Johnny's way of saying, "I love you." Silently, anonymously. The Tonight Show's final episode aired May 22, 1992. At the end, Carson turned to Ed. The two men simply looked at each other for several seconds. No words. In that look was everything: 30 years of memories, unspoken gratitude, and love that couldn't be confessed. After Carson's death in 2005, McMahon spoke about him in numerous interviews, his eyes always filling with tears he couldn't control. "Johnny was the most complex person I ever knew," he said once, voice trembling. "I knew he loved me in his way, but I wish he'd said it just once. Just once would have been enough." When McMahon died in 2009, family members revealed he still kept a copy of that anonymous check from Carson, a silent testament to a friendship that lasted 30 years but was never spoken aloud. Bob Newhart was stand-up comedy's most unusual and unlikely figure. When he emerged in the 1960s, he didn't shout like other comedians, didn't make exaggerated gestures or wild facial expressions. Instead, he performed brilliantly conceived one-sided phone conversations, leaving long pauses, letting audiences use their imagination to fill in the other half of the dialogue. This revolutionary anti-comedy style puzzled many industry veterans who couldn't understand why audiences were laughing, but it deeply impressed Johnny Carson in ways he rarely expressed to anyone. When Newhart appeared on The Tonight Show, the entire atmosphere in the studio shifted noticeably. Carson's interaction with him was visibly different from his exchanges with other guests, even major stars. He laughed genuinely at Newhart's stories, not the practiced professional laugh he deployed for audiences and cameras, but one that crinkled the corners of his eyes and sometimes left him momentarily breathless. Johnny's fake laugh only moved his mouth, recalled a longtime director who spent 15 years observing Carson up close. But when Newhart was on stage, Johnny's whole face lit up like a child's. That reaction was completely real and unguarded. You couldn't fake that kind of response. Backstage, Carson's respect for Newhart was even more apparent to those who paid close attention. Carson rarely complimented comedians, at least not to their faces. He viewed most performers as good entertainers, but reserved genuine admiration for very few. Johnny once told me privately, "Bob is the smartest man I've ever seen in this business," recalled a longtime producer. "I never heard him say that about any other comedian in all my years working with him." And Johnny didn't hand out praise easily, especially when it came to intelligence. Both men came from remarkably similar backgrounds in the Midwest. Carson from Norfolk, Nebraska, and Newhart from Oak Park, Illinois. Both were products of heartland values, understated, practical, suspicious of showiness, naturally introverted observers rather than performers in social situations. In Hollywood's flashy, self-promoting world, both men often felt like perpetual outsiders watching a strange land. This shared sensibility created an unspoken bond between them that didn't require explanation or discussion. Carson famously hated social events and Hollywood parties, but once or twice a year he'd host small, intimate dinners at his Malibu home exclusively for people he truly valued and respected. The guest list for these rare gatherings revealed Carson's genuine inner circle. Bob Newhart was always on that list, without exception. At those private dinners, the real Johnny emerged, recalled a former NBC executive who attended several over the years. Away from cameras and audiences, the mask came off. He and Bob would talk for hours about comedy philosophy, about life's absurdities, about Hollywood's ridiculousness. It was genuine friendship, the kind Johnny rarely allowed himself to have. But Carson never displayed this friendship publicly on The Tonight Show. When introducing Newhart, he used the same professional warmth he showed every other guest. Nothing more, nothing less. Johnny saw Bob as his intellectual equal, which was extraordinarily rare for him, noted one biographer who studied Carson extensively. But saying it publicly was impossible for Johnny. It was as if complimenting someone openly meant surrendering power to them, showing a vulnerability he simply couldn't afford to reveal. Jonathan Winters was comedy's most dangerous weapon. When he took the stage, nobody knew what would happen, including himself. 1 second he'd play an old woman, the next an alien dictator. This unpredictability made him a genius, but for a control freak like Carson, it was also terrifying. Carson ran The Tonight Show like clockwork. Every segment timed, every transition rehearsed. Control meant safety. Yet here was the paradox. Carson loved Jonathan Winters. Winters embodied everything Carson suppressed. Freedom, spontaneity, complete disregard for rules. When Jonathan came, we threw out all plans, recalled a floor manager. A 10-minute segment? Jonathan might do 20 or 3. You couldn't control anything, and Johnny, control freak Johnny, loved it. You could see the sparkle in his eyes. The most striking example came during a mid-1970s show when Winters improvised for 15 minutes with just a stick, transforming it into hundreds of objects. Carson sat mouth open, watching. When Winters finished, Carson was speechless, then said, "I have no idea what just happened, but it was genius." Winters struggled with serious mental health issues, bipolar disorder and depression. During the 1960s, he was hospitalized several times. Carson sent flowers and handwritten notes during hospital stays. Jonathan treasured Johnny's letters. A close friend revealed, they kept him going during his darkest days. Carson guaranteed Winters could appear on The Tonight Show whenever he wanted. Most guests waited months, recalled the talent coordinator, but Jonathan had a different rule. Johnny said when Jonathan wants to come on, he's on that night. No other guest had that privilege. Carson once confided to a close friend about Winters. Jonathan is pure genius. I've spent my entire life trying to control everything, every word, every gesture, every moment. Jonathan is completely free from all of that. Sometimes watching him perform, something deep inside me weeps. I wish I could be like that, even for just one moment. But I never will be. Carson and Winters remained close until Carson's death in 2005. Winters outlived him by 8 years, and in interviews during that time, he often spoke about Carson with deep affection and gratitude. Katharine Hepburn was Hollywood's uncrowned queen. Over 60 years, she won 4 Oscars and became one of cinema's most iconic figures. But what made her legendary wasn't just talent, it was character. She was everything women weren't supposed to be. Independent, sharp-tongued, bowing to no one. She refused talk shows, declined interviews, kept her life private. Carson had a complicated relationship with strong women. 4 failed marriages, ex-wives describing him as emotionally unavailable. But Hepburn was different. He couldn't control her, and perhaps that's why he admired her. Johnny was both terrified and fascinated by Hepburn, recalled a producer. With other guests, Johnny held control. With Hepburn, the roles reversed. In 1973, the impossible happened. Hepburn agreed to appear on The Tonight Show, her only talk show appearance ever. She refused pre-interviews and question reviews. Johnny will ask what he wants. I'll answer what I want, she declared. The production team panicked. Johnny was nervous in a different way. I saw him experience stage fright for the first time. When the show started, tension was palpable. Hepburn received a standing ovation lasting minutes. Throughout, Carson's usual control was absent. Hepburn steered questions wherever she wished, gave cutting responses to tedious questions. Several times, instead of laughing at Carson's jokes, she fixed him with sharp looks. But beneath the tension lay mutual respect. At one point, Hepburn said, "You're smarter than you let on, aren't you?" This easygoing image is a front. Carson seemed to drop his mask, then smiled. "Can you keep that a secret?" That was 2 masters recognizing each other. After the show, they spoke privately for half an hour in the green room. What they discussed was never revealed to anyone. Carson later told close friends, "She's the most impressive woman I've ever met in my entire life, and simultaneously the most challenging guest of my career. Feeling such admiration while being so nervous that had never happened to me before." Hepburn died in 2003, 2 years before Carson. He made no public statement about her death, but those close to him said he was deeply affected. He watched her old films for days afterward, one friend recalled. That was Johnny's way of mourning. Privately silent, Steve Martin burst onto America in the mid-1970s, like a storm. With his white hair, arrow-through-the-head headband, and wild and crazy guy persona, he was revolutionizing comedy. He'd abandoned traditional setup punchline for absurdism, irony, and meta-humor. Watching this young man, Carson felt the future racing toward him. Carson was legendary for discovering young talent. The Tonight Show launched dozens of careers, but Steve Martin was different. Carson saw not just a comedian who'd succeed, but a force that would change the entire industry. This was both exhilarating and terrifying. Martin's first major Tonight Show performance came in 1974. When he finished, the audience went wild. But Carson's reaction was different. He was smiling while applauding. But something else was in his eyes. "I'll never forget Johnny's face," recalled a camera operator. Pride, yes, but also sadness. Maybe awareness his era was ending. Steve was the future. Johnny knew it. Carson invited Martin back 7 times, extraordinary for a new comedian. But backstage, emotions were complex. Johnny once said, "Steve will take everything I did and throw it away. And he'll be right," recalled someone from Carson's circle. He didn't say it bitterly. There was acceptance. But also awareness. An era was ending. Their relationship resembled father-son dynamics in many ways. Carson quietly supported Martin's career behind the scenes, spoke with NBC executives on his behalf, recommended him to other shows and producers, opened doors Martin didn't even know existed. But characteristically, he never told Martin any of this directly. Johnny never told me to my face that he believed in me. Martin recalled years later in an interview, but I heard from others constantly. He'd open doors everywhere, talk to important people on my behalf. Typical Johnny, he wouldn't show his love directly, but he'd make sure you felt its effects. When Carson died in 2005, Martin was one of the few people invited to the private memorial service. He spoke about Carson with tears in his eyes, calling him the most important figure in my career and one of the most influential people in my life. When Joan Rivers first appeared on The Tonight Show in 1965, she was unknown, struggling, nearly ready to quit. After her performance, Carson said, "My God, you're going to be a star." That moment was Rivers' turning point and the beginning of her special relationship with Carson. Carson didn't just discover Rivers, he took her under his wing. He brought her on repeatedly, recommended her to producers, helped build her career, but their relationship went beyond mentor-protege. Carson saw Rivers almost like a daughter. With 3 sons but no daughter, Rivers held a special place. Johnny treated Joan unlike any other guest, recalled a producer. He protected her, took pride in her successes, like she was truly family. In 1983, Rivers became The Tonight Show's permanent guest host, the person who hosted when Carson was away. This marked Rivers as Carson's heir. Hollywood whispered she'd one day host The Tonight Show. In 1986, Fox offered Rivers her own late-night show competing directly with Carson. Rivers accepted what she saw as her career's opportunity. But she made a critical mistake. She signed without telling Carson. He learned from television. Those who witnessed Carson's reaction never forgot. He was devastated, recalled an NBC executive. This was more than professional betrayal. It was personal. Johnny had seen her as family, and Joan switched to a rival without even a phone call. Carson's response was one sentence: "She's dead to me now." From that day, Carson never mentioned Rivers' name. She was banned from The Tonight Show. Rivers attempted reconciliation repeatedly. Letters, messages through friends, public apologies. Nothing worked. Carson had erased her completely. Rivers' Fox show didn't survive one season. Then her husband Edgar committed suicide in 1987, under financial pressure. Rivers entered her darkest period. The man who once saw her as family said nothing. When Edgar died, I didn't get a condolence card from Johnny. Rivers recalled, eyes filling. Nothing. As if I'd never existed. Carson died in January 2005. They never reconciled. Nearly 20 years of complete, unwavering silence. Rivers spoke about him in interviews after his death, and the wound was obviously still raw, still bleeding after all those years. "I loved Johnny," Rivers said afterward, her voice breaking audibly. "He was more than a father to me. He created my entire career, believed in me when nobody else did, and I hurt him terribly. I know that. I've always known that. But his refusal to ever forgive me, his complete silence for all those years, that will remain my life's greatest pain and deepest regret, until the day I die." Rivers herself died in 2014, 9 years after Carson. In her final interviews, she was still talking about him, still expressing regret, still wishing she could go back and make that one phone call that might have changed everything. Johnny Carson's relationships with these 6 remarkable people reveal far more about him than we ever knew while he was alive. The man who entered America's living rooms for 30 consecutive years, making millions laugh every single night, was actually someone terrified of expressing genuine emotion, constitutionally unable to speak his love in words, instinctively avoiding true intimacy. But this didn't mean he was incapable of love. Quite the opposite. Carson loved deeply and intensely. He just found it nearly impossible to show that love openly. Ed McMahon represented the tragic silence that often characterizes male friendship. 30 years sitting side by side, yet "I love you" remained impossible for both men. Bob Newhart embodied an intellectual bond expressed entirely without words. 2 Midwest outsiders, recognizing each other in Hollywood's flashy world. Jonathan Winters reflected Carson's suppressed desire for freedom, the control freak watching the completely free man and weeping inside. Katharine Hepburn represented the purest form of his complicated feelings towards strong women. Steve Martin made him look at the future with equal measures of hope and melancholy, and Joan Rivers represented both the brightest and darkest faces of his love simultaneously. Johnny's love wasn't like normal people's love, reflected a Tonight Show producer who knew him well. When he loved someone, he'd protect them fiercely, support them invisibly, elevate their careers, but he would never say it out loud. And once he felt betrayed, that love would vanish completely and forever. Forgiveness was simply impossible for him. It wasn't in his emotional vocabulary. These 6 relationships ultimately show us the profoundly lonely man behind television's biggest star, someone who made millions laugh every single night but came home to utter solitude, who protected those he loved but couldn't tell them, who elevated those he admired but couldn't admit it to their faces. Perhaps Carson's true tragedy was simply this: he knew how to love, but he never learned how to express that love openly. And perhaps that's why, on that final night of The Tonight Show in May 1992, the silent look he shared with Ed McMahon meant more than 30 years of unspoken words ever could. Because sometimes the deepest love is expressed not with words, but with silence and presence. Johnny Carson understood this truth better than anyone. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed discovering Johnny Carson's hidden stories, please subscribe. In our next video, we'll reveal the names Carson banned forever from The Tonight Show and the shocking stories behind those bans. Which relationship affected you most? Ed McMahon's silent friendship or Joan Rivers' tragic break? Tell me in the comments. See you in the next video.